I talked myself out of the purchase on a regular basis. I didn't have time. Where would I keep it? And any number of other excuses. The aircraft itself was for sale due to a personal tragedy. The builder of the full-sized replica was John Day. He was a master craftsman and had also built a beautiful Newport 17 and a spectacular Fokker E3 Eindecker. He flew the latter aircraft in a display team dedicated to recreating the sights and sounds of early air combat, the Great War Display Team. When flying the Fokker Eindecker in team practice in 2013, the aircraft crashed and John was killed. His widow put the triplane up for sale. After stalling for a month or so, I turned up on a freezing, rain-sodden winter's day at Popham Airfield in Hampshire. The aircraft was in storage and the engine inhibited. Slowly, Gordon Brander, the display team manager, and I pulled off the tarpaulin, and I almost gasped at the aircraft. Despite being a replica, every tiny detail was as real as could be. John had made no concession to modernity. Here was combat, red in tooth and claw. The triplane is a big machine. I mounted the cockpit. I say mounted because you get in and out of a triplane like a horse. The massive prop stood at the vertical, and in front of me, menacingly, were the two synchronized machine guns that made the triplane a deadly adversary in a dogfight. A chill went up my spine. The aircraft was primal. I'll buy it. Once the weather improved, we could ready the aircraft for a ferry flight to restore her to operational status. I had a home for her in the same hangar as the Booker Youngman, and also Gordon's own Sopwith triplane. Quite a cool hangar, it must be said. To get me up to operational status as a display pilot would take some hard work, but there was a busy season in 2014 because of the commemoration of the start of the First World War. The team was much in demand. I flew the Booker Youngman around to obtain my display license. In effect, I was performing dummy runs with hedges and trees, simulating crowd lines, with my instructor, Dan Griffiths, observing me from the front seat. There was an element of ground school to pass and a flight test. Dan is a highly experienced test pilot. In fact, he was, for a while, the chief test pilot of the UK Civil Aviation Authority. Luckily, he also flew the Fokker triplane, so there was quite a chance of some knowledge transfer, but no chance of a dummy run on the aircraft itself. The Fokker only has one seat. The first time you fly it is, well, the first and hopefully not the last time you land it. On the 9th of April 2014, according to my logbook, I became a triplane pilot. I made a couple of bunny hops down the runway with the wheels just leaving the ground and then back to a full stop. Old aircraft always operated into wind and, especially with a triplane, any crosswind is strictly verboten. A wooden skid on the tail and the lack of effective brakes ensured that the machine would always operate on grass. Forward vision on the ground was virtually zero. The massive wings blotted out the horizon. It was like taxiing a combination of a Venetian blind and a bookcase. Simply starting the Fokker was hazardous. The massive wooden prop would kill you in an instant, and there was no starter fitted other than a human being to swing the propeller. In the cockpit, by far the safest place to be, there was a complex ballet requiring 4 hands and both knees, plus a great deal of shouting. Sometimes the aircraft would start almost spontaneously, especially from cold. On a hot day, it could take 20 minutes of hard work, always conscious that a mistake could be fatal. After my hops down the grass runway at White Waltham, I taxied back to the start. The wind was light, straight down the field. Gordon looked at me from the sidelines. I gave a shrug. Now or never, I thought. I put my thumbs up and pointed down the runway. Game on. As I opened up to full throttle, the tail rose in a few yards, and suddenly the world came into view between the camouflage and duck-egg blue of the wing fabric. My aircraft was not a red triplane. It was painted in the authentic colours of Lieutenant Johannes Janssen. He survived the war, and to my delight, Corgi made a metal model triplane, which is a replica of my replica, complete with the same paint job. In the air, the triplane was in its element. I can do no more than quote the Red Baron himself when he was asked how it was to fly the Fokker. "She can climb like a monkey and manoeuvre like the devil." My 3 landings that day in benign conditions were really quite reasonable. Beginner's luck. I already had a crazy idea of what the Great War Display Team could do for rock and roll. Why not a dogfight at a festival to honour the combatants of the First World War? Our final show at Nebworth was the obvious location, but first I had to join the team and learn the delicate art of chasing 100-year-old aircraft around at 50 feet above the ground without crashing. 2 days of team practice put me as Fokker 1 in the 9-aircraft display. I finished off the 15 minutes of simulated combat by chasing the Sopwith triplane up, down and along the crowd line until we performed a head-on pass. I hit the smoke button and spluttered off, wounded, but returned as we flew a final fly-past salute. None of this is supposed to be dangerous to the crowd, and very stringent rules exist to ensure that this is the case. While danger is minimised to the public during the course of the action, it's never far away for pilots when chasing each other close to the ground. Far and away the greatest hazard is getting close up and personal with the tail of an aircraft and flying into the disturbed air and propeller wash. The primitive flying controls and aerofoils used on the wings make for a double whammy. Not only will the aircraft suddenly and without warning drop a wingtip toward the ground, but the pilot has to be quick and use absolutely every flight control in whatever axis it takes to keep from turning into a smoking ruin. At altitude, it's merely uncomfortable, but being thrown on your side at 50 feet above the ground in front of 25,000 people at the Duxford Air Show certainly warrants your full attention. Chapter 44. To Ride the Storm. After the summer, I wanted to clear the decks for what was to be a very important Iron Maiden album. Steve was unhappy about writing in a rehearsal studio. He had a point. Anyone could stand outside with a digital recorder and bootleg the album before we had even recorded it. Instead, we went direct to the recording studio and rehearsed, wrote and recorded in the same place. It was one of the best decisions we ever made. I'd broached the possibility of a jumbo jet for a world tour. Rod was jumping with excitement about it. The tour would start in February 2015. The album itself had so much going on that it quickly became a double album. Digital recording, in my case, meant trying to get my digits to play the piano. I had 2 aviation songs on the album. One was Death or Glory, about the Red Baron and life and death on the front line in the air war, and the other was Empire of the Clouds, my 2-fingered piano-based epic. I sat at home with a very modest electric piano I'd won in a charity raffle and started doodling, coming up with some small sequences and an atmospheric intro. The plan was to write a Great War aerial warfare epic, and a piano intro was the opener. Death or Glory, though, said it all in a much shorter span. I have at home a few artefacts that I purchased at an auction of airship memorabilia. At the auction, anything German was going for ridiculous prices. Crockery, bits of aluminium from crashed Zeppelins, all going for crazy money. What interested me was the British aviation heritage. 2 items in particular I found fascinating. One was a pocket watch of one of the few survivors of the R-101, the British airship that tragically crashed on its maiden voyage, killing most of those on board. The other was a tankard from the R-101, possibly a promotional item. It was a leather-embossed case with a pewter mug inside. Faded in the brown leather could be seen the airship itself, complete with its registration, Golf Foxtrot Alpha Alpha Whiskey. Around the rim of the pewter was inscribed, "Welcome aboard from the airship crew." Late one night, after coming in from the pub, I sat playing the intro over and over. On my bookshelf, I had several rare airship volumes. One of them, To Ride the Storm, is a classic analysis of the R101 accident. I closed my eyes, and instead of seeing a row of First World War aircraft at dawn, with mist hanging in the trees and frost turning to dew on their airframes, I saw a great silver cigar hanging in the sky. I could handle the pewter tankard and the watch. They were a tangible link back to the fateful day of the crash, and they drove me to the piano, a concert grand this time, in the studio, till long after the rest of the band had gone home. Empire of the Clouds grew into the story of the R101, the greatest flying machine the world had ever seen, truly so big that the entire Titanic would have fitted inside. It was a story of human error, hubris, compassion, heroism, and sheer bad luck. The rest of the album was no less ambitious, and unless a song was obviously brief, we saw no reason to compromise on the grounds that people had short attention spans. Iron Maiden fans are quite used to engaging their brains. By the time Kevin Shirley, our producer, arrived, we already had 2 or 3 songs ready to go, and the rest were works in progress. Once we got stuck into the business of tracking, we worked fast. Maiden's a curious mix of old-school playing, all of it for real, while using new technology simply to represent what we do naturally. Basically, digital hard drives enabled us to capture every sound, good, bad, or indifferent, that we played. Because of the internal geography of the studio, it was easy to cluster in a circle around the drums. The building's previous incarnation as a cinema from the 30s made for a drum room par excellence. The nooks and crannies in the walls contained guitar speakers, each in isolation. Each musician had his own headphone mix, controlled by a tiny personal mixing desk right by his side. The whole monitor setup belonged to Kevin, and it was the key to getting the results out of us. On the 6th of October, we started, ironically, with The Great Unknown. And on the 25th of November, we finally put Empire of the Clouds to bed at the mixing stage. On the 12th of December, I was diagnosed with head and neck cancer, and the world stopped, dead in its tracks. Chapter 45. Fuck cancer. 6 weeks previously, I'd come to the same conclusion via self-diagnosis on the internet. I knew something was wrong in my body. I was sweating a bit at night. Maybe it was the sheets in the hotel. There were occasional flecks of blood when I cleaned my teeth. Maybe I was brushing too hard. I felt as if I was about to catch a cold, but I didn't. Hey, it was November, and there were lots of bugs going around. Lastly, one of the glands in my neck was swollen. See excuse above. Except there was an odd smell coming from the back of my throat, like rotten cheese. It was quite disgusting. I plugged the symptoms into search engines and, given my age, came up with a diagnosis of squamous cell carcinoma, probably related to HPV, human papillomavirus infection. This I then ignored. I had an album to do, I was singing well, and I was having a great time. The last thing we needed was a Google hypochondriac. Nevertheless, the lump in my neck got bigger, and my sweaty episodes were now sometimes in the daytime as well. As the last note rang out on the finished mixes of the album, I asked someone at the studio to call a doctor. The French doctor was sharp, and even with his limited English, his advice was clear. You must have a CT scan on your head and neck, you must have a chest x-ray, and here are some antibiotics in the unlikely event that it is an infection. I decided to do everything back in England. My doctor in England felt the lump. Are you losing weight? She asked. Ha ha ha. Oh, I wish. They all say that, she replied grimly. and sent me downstairs for an ultrasound after taking an armful of blood for testing. The ultrasound guy probed around. His assistant was a bit of a Maiden fan. "How are you with needles?" he asked. "I want to poke your lump and take a few cells out." This was Monday, the 8th of December. On Wednesday, the blood results came back. All good. But I knew there was something else. On Friday, I had 3 missed calls from the doctor. "You have squamous cells in your biopsy, which are cancerous." That evening, I was in front of the head and neck and ear, nose and throat specialist. A year and a half previously, I'd had a full ENT checkup. I was right as rain. It was a gigantic room on Harley Street with a huge desk and a very eminent-looking doctor. She opened her folder. "I have here a letter stating that you have head and neck cancer," she stated bluntly. I was momentarily taken aback at the starkness of the approach. I decided to return service. "Okay, so what is it? Where is it? Why is it? And how do we get rid of it?" I countered. I think she rather liked the approach. "Well, you are taking it rather well. I could roll around and chew the carpet if it makes you feel better, but let's get on with it." "Do you have any plans for the next few days?" she asked. "As of now, my only plan is to get rid of this, and my only goal is to achieve it. If that doesn't work, I'll have to think of a new plan." Monday was an MRI scan of my head and neck with a dye that made the cancer visible and also made you want to pee yourself. Next was a chest X-ray, and after that, a day in hospital under anaesthetic, having my tongue and any other bits biopsied. I was beginning to feel quite important, but in amongst the bravado was the temptation to despair. For the next 3 days or so, all I noticed were hospitals, churches, and graveyards. By God, London was infested with the bloody things. On the way to the pub, I considered how I felt about my cancer. Nobody could answer the question, why me? Actually, I reasoned, it's probably just shitty bad luck. Nobody was out to get me, and my cancer was an aberration. I thought about hating it, but I'm not good at long-term hating. I'm a momentary flash-in-the-pan sort of chap when it comes to anger. I would say life is too short to hate cancer. I would treat my cancer as an uninvited guest and politely but firmly dismiss it from my house. The person to act as my personal cancer bouncer was the head of radio-oncology at St Bartholomew's Hospital in London. I had scans on the Monday, and by Friday, the 19th of December, I was in front of Dr. Armand Sibtain. I had 2 tumours. One, 3.5 centimetres across, golf ball size, was the primary, located in the base of my tongue, and the other, 2.5 centimetres across, was a secondary tumour in the lymph node, adjacent to the primary. The rotten smell from my throat was necrotic cancer cells draining from the lymph node. Nice. Cancers are staged according to their size and spread. Stage 1 means the cancer is small and contained. Stage 2 is slightly larger but hasn't spread. Stage 3 has spread a bit, and Stage 4 means the cancer has spread further through the body. In addition, each tumour has unique characteristics, and cells are broadly grouped as well-differentiated, moderately differentiated, and poorly differentiated. Translation? Well stuck together, easier to kill, moderately stuck, might go a-wandering, and poorly stuck together, aggressive mavericks on a mission to wreak havoc. Typically, 80% of this type of cancer was moderately differentiated, and mine was no different. From the moment Armand spoke, softly and gently, I believed I would be cured. At first, I felt sorry for Armand. What an awful task to tell people such bad news, and sometimes watch them die. As we progressed through the treatment, I realised that he relished his job, and I began to speculate a bit more about what drives oncologists. "You're a bit like a cross between a sniper and Sherlock Holmes," I suggested. He grinned. He was also a rock fan. Not till he cured me did he confess that it was Rush, not Iron Maiden, that floated his boat. "Do you smoke?" he asked. "No? Why? How much difference does that make?" "I'm 20% more likely to get rid of it, and it's 20% less likely to come back." My treatment would start on the 5th of January. Before that was a trip to the dentist, as there was a chance I would have to have my teeth removed. Radiation and the lower jaw are not happy bedfellows. The bone is permanently affected, whereas the soft tissue can, by and large, heal itself over time. The upshot was that if any of my teeth required work or were likely to have to be removed in the future, the procedure would take place immediately. I could not begin radiation treatment until all the healing had taken place. My salivary glands were also liable to be put out of action by the radiation, though, thanks to new technology, it was possible that I would get most of the functionality back. Saliva is also, of course, extremely protective for teeth. I'd recently lost a molar in the middle of the tour. A root canal had cracked, and I spent 2 weeks in pain as the antibiotics slowly failed and extraction was the only option. Standing at the back was one solitary molar that looked like the rock at Masada. "Were you considering an implant?" asked my dentist. Well, I had considered it. Why? Well, we would have to do it and wait until it had healed before— "You mean delay the treatment?" "Yes. If I don't have an implant, will the teeth either side look like the Leaning Tower of Pisa?" She laughed. "No, it doesn't work like that. In which case, let's get on with it and get stuck into the cancer." Back to see Armin, I asked a few more questions. Actually, a lot of questions. Like, was it an HPV cancer? Well, let's wait for all the results. Given a green light by the oncology dentist, I went for another scan. This time, I was strapped on a gurney and a thermoplastic head and neck mold was created, which would be my home for every radiation treatment. The only tattoo I possess looks like a small biro spot on my sternum. The nurses made it so they could align my body to within fractions of a millimetre on the radiation machinery. Armin was playing a video game with my 3D head, shooting radiation pulses at different angles and intensities to kill the tumours and also to irradiate any other sites that might have been subtly infiltrated. He warned me that I would lose a lot of weight and that I would be very tired towards the end of the treatment and my immune system would be fried. I could pop a feeding tube in before Christmas. You mean cut a hole in me? Yes, it's very simple. Most people can't feed themselves in the latter stages, and it's very important you keep up nutrition. You're not cutting a hole in me. I will feed myself. If I can't, I'll let you know, and you can stick a tube up my nose. I was not going to turn into a hospital bed dweller. How long before I recover? Armin gave a good think to that one. I had an RAF fighter pilot sitting where you are now, with exactly the same tumour. It was 12 months before he was fit, fat, and healthy again. 12 months? That was too long. I would be bored by then. I'll beat that, I declared. I'd barely considered the question of whether I would sing again, which surprised me. I realised that I loved life above all else, and if singing was the price to pay, then so be it. Armin was acutely aware of my predicament. I've replanned your treatment twice now. There's a natural anatomical plane, which means I will miss your larynx with the radiation. Hit me with your best shot, as the song goes. Of course, my whole existence was now digging up every scrap of information on radiation therapy, survival percentages, and any alternative assistance that might help. The dental issue had freaked me out. I read up on hyperbaric oxygen therapy, which was possibly a way of mitigating the damage to the bone. You're worried about that tooth at the back, aren't you? He smiled. I nodded. Well, don't worry. I've bent the radiation beam around it to avoid damage. Dr. Armin Sibtain, magician. Christmas was coming. I was determined to eat and drink like a pig and put on as much weight as I could before the 5th of January, when I would start chemotherapy and radiation simultaneously for 9 weeks. I had to get my house in order because I wanted to come out the other side fighting. My aviation medicals in the UK and USA would be suspended as soon as I started treatment, and getting them back would be tough. Nevertheless, while I still had a medical, I renewed my 737 and 757 licenses in the simulator on the 3rd and 4th of January. The Iron Maiden tour was to be postponed, and Rod wanted to tell the world that I had cancer after New Year. "You don't want this to get out there uncontrolled. Someone is sure to recognise you going into treatment. Better to announce and control it. Also, we have to tell the promoters something." Fortunately, the tour was largely arranged, but not yet announced. "Tell them the reasons are too tumorous to mention," I muttered darkly. "Can we at least wait until I've finished my treatment?" Reluctantly, he agreed. Fighting cancer is a lonely business. I don't mean this in a maudlin sense, but it's such an intensely personal condition that it's hard for others to get close. The only people who can fight the tumour are you and the doctors and nurses supporting you. The more research I did, the more I was convinced that any edge you could obtain was worth it to win the battle. I explored anti-tumour alternatives, and both grape seed extract and a shiitake mushroom extract called AHCC showed promise in clinical trials. AHCC had also cleared HPV infections in 6 out of 12 women in a University of Texas study. My chemotherapy drug was cisplatin, one of the first chemotherapy drugs. It shrinks tumours, but is highly toxic to the rest of the body. I downloaded the government toxicology report. It contained the wonderfully obscure phrase, "The method by which this is demonstrated has not yet been fully elucidated." In other words, no one yet knows why this drug works, but it does. The platin bit of cisplatin refers to platinum, which I was shoveling into my cells. I had plenty of platinum albums, and now I was turning into one. I sat in hospital for 6 hours on a drip that squirted several litres of special saline into me, then had a bag of drugs to stop me throwing up, and then the cisplatin itself. I felt high as a kite. "Nurse, what's in that bag?" "Anti-sickness drugs." "Any steroids?" "Oh, yes, lots of steroids." The steroids were there to stop my kidneys from going into shock when the platinum albums arrived, and I didn't go home until I was pissing out platinum like a racehorse. The first week of treatment was like the phony war in the Second World War. Nothing much happened, except I lost my sense of taste, a side effect that I'd been warned about. Hair loss was a similar possibility, and in protest at having cancer, I grew a bushy, nasty-looking beard. Cisplatin can be toxic to hearing and also to mental functioning, so-called chemo brain. I found a University of Toronto study experimenting with aspirin to alleviate the side effects. In the UK, the University of Southampton was continuing the trials. I discovered the dosages and self-medicated. My chance of survival at diagnosis was, I learned, 60%. I wasn't terribly happy about it, but it was 10% better than 50-50. If, however, my tumour was associated with a human papillomavirus, HPV, my chance of survival leapt to 70%, or possibly as much as 90%, as a fit non-smoker. My Christmas present was a phone call from Dr. Sibtain on Christmas Eve. I was in the supermarket. "Good news about the bad news. It is a P16 tumour, which puts you in a whole different percentage for recovery." It was the best Christmas present, short of being told it was all a terrible mistake. Getting rid of cancer became a job like any other. Monday to Friday, at 11 a.m, I turned up at the hospital, and half an hour later, I was on the street, with 2 greys of radiation glowering away at my insides. The routine was the same. Turn up, say hello, take a gown, lie on the gurney, strapped down tight, barely able to breathe. The giant machine resembled a lathe that circled my head. Lying still, unable to move, an internal snapshot of where I was the previous day compared to where I was today. The metre-thick concrete doors slid shut. The noises made by the machine became familiar. When the beam was switched on, there were 3 pulses, and I counted the seconds. 45, 45, then 30. I was being bombarded by X-ray energy created by accelerating photons to the required speed. There was no radioactive substance in the machine. The beam was thus able to modulate the intensity of the radiation to different tissue around my head by varying the power to the photons. Not only that, but the beam could change its shape because of a device called a collimator. Think of 2 sets of Venetian blinds at 90 degrees to each other, which can open and shut independently. The tiny slats were less than the thickness of a pencil lead. It was thus possible to deliver large doses to the tumours while shielding surrounding tissue, and smaller doses to other lymph nodes, all in the same 360-degree pattern. I was receiving IMRT, intensity modulated radiation therapy, and it was cutting-edge stuff. The nurse in charge of me, Mandy, told me to buy an electric razor and gave me a tub of cream for my neck. As the treatment progressed, the creams became different and the redness and radiation burns more evident. At first, I didn't need painkillers, but gradually the radiation stripped my tongue of its mucus lining and my immune system fell on its face. Oral thrush appeared, a common infection, and the painkillers got stronger until finally I was on oral morphine for the last 10 days or so. Sleeping, eating, drinking, and talking became very difficult. The pain from all the nerves in my tongue being exposed was intense. My throat was swollen. I devised a system to get to sleep for a couple of hours. I raided every local chemist for their oral topical anaesthetics and soaked kitchen roll in them and wrapped my rear teeth in the paper towel. My tongue stayed numb for just long enough to get to sleep. Bliss. After the first 2 weeks, I was still pretending there was nothing wrong with me, and I would go to the pub, even though everything tasted like water. One day, my chest started to itch. I looked down. It's the bloody cat, I thought. But no, the hairs were too short. It was me. My beard was falling out. There's no protocol for having your face fall off in front of your drinking companions. I went to the loo and plucked the underside of my chin. The hair simply fell off. I got as far as looking like James Mason playing Captain Nemo in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and went back to the bar. The next day, I went and had my radiation. Eating was still possible, so I went to a cafe and ordered breakfast, scrambled eggs and smoked salmon. I could smell it, but I might as well have been eating frog spawn. It tasted of nothing. Absent-mindedly, I scratched my cheek. The opposite table regarded me with a look of horror. I looked down at my scrambled eggs. It was not black pepper, but beard bits that were tumbling from my face. Back home, I adjusted further. OK, not James Mason. I plucked out a nice D'Artagnan number. Next day, that too fell out. I was left with a rather scratchy moustache and some rogue sideburns. In protest, I kept the moustache. Everyone I knew hated it, which made me more determined to keep it. I had cancer. What's your excuse? Gradually, the side effects built up. A mouth ulcer at first, skin breaking out, and weight loss. As it became difficult to feed myself, I was ever grateful for being a singer. One of the first things that has to be in control is the tongue, and I could therefore flatten it, open my gullet, and take a huge gulp of whatever I could manage before the pain kicked in. By the last 3 weeks of treatment, I was on liquids only and could not speak simply because moving my tongue was agony. Custard saved my life. I mixed a pint of full-fat custard from the fridge with a medical milkshake and could manage to get it down in 3 or 4 big gulps. The whole process still took almost 40 minutes, with the odd bestial noises in lieu of being able to scream, "Fucking hell, that hurts!" At the beginning of treatment, I'd done 50 press-ups every day, plus long walks around Regent's Park after radiation. I had books to read through, and I would sit on the steps of Marylebone Church, where there was an outdoor coffee stand. I could smell it, but no taste. Over the years, my lack of taste in matters like clothing, and in particular trousers, has never bothered me. Lack of taste with food bothered me more than I expected. Biscuits tasted like sand, chocolate like plasticine. Only aromatic foods gave any hint of flavour, and that was just because of the smell. Slowly, my energy levels dropped. One day I went to the supermarket, only a few hundred yards. I shuffled around and got halfway back to the house before I realised I could go no further. This was beyond exhausted. It was as if every cell in the marrow of my bones was saying, "Lie down, right now, give up." I sat on a low brick wall for a few minutes to recover. This was fatigue. I thought I'd been tired in my life, but actually, I'd not even been close. Early on in treatment, I planned my TV schedule. I would be watching a lot of it. Daytime TV was full of cheery adverts for cancer charities, complete with suffering victims asking for contributions. And if that didn't cheer me up, there was a string of life insurance ads, plus several offering help with funeral costs. I'd calibrated my treatment and recovery to a repeat of the classic TV series, The Avengers. At 8 p.m. every night after a repeat of MASH, all of the Diana Rigg episodes were being shown Monday to Friday. My 33rd and last radiation session was on the 18th of February. My last 3-week chemo cycle was beginning on the 16th of February. The radiation would actually peak in my system 10 days after the last administration of it, and would then continue to work for at least 2 to 3 months afterwards, but at a declining rate. So my peak radiation effect and peak chemo would be on the 28th of February. I calculated that this would be the episode when Diana Rigg handed over to Linda Thorson. On that day, I would cease to watch The Avengers, and I would restart the process of normality, even if I had to pretend. Oral morphine was a terrific disappointment. I was at least expecting pink elephants or literary inspiration, even a desire to cut off my ear and paint scary pictures of daffodils. No such luck. It made you drowsy, didn't seem to kill that much of the pain, and worst of all, removed the ability to have a poo. A liquid diet of custard and milkshakes didn't help, although I emptied sachets of oatmeal into the milk in an attempt to keep at least something regular. The anti-sickness meds, plus morphine, put paid to any hope of normal operation. To add to my meds, I now had a delightful substance called Movicol. I regarded it with suspicion. I was on various anti-emetic pills, occasional steroids, oral morphine, plus a most impressive substance that created a lizard-like second skin around my neck to prevent the real skin splitting open. In addition, I had a bag full of antibiotics and had to take my temperature constantly in case I should spontaneously combust. I had lost over 20 pounds, 9 kilos in weight, and my head felt like it was on fire. Seeing as I had received the equivalent of 11 lethal full-body radiation doses spread over 45 days, all of it in my head and neck region, it was not surprising. My body was eating itself. The damage to my cells put the repair teams and my metabolism in hyperdrive. The damage to the tumour was, hopefully, permanent. None of this helped my tummy troubles. In Monty Python's Life of Brian, there's a girl named Incontinentia Buttocks. Chance would have been a fine thing. My insomnia was ongoing. 2 hours sleep, plus the pain of the tongue, and I was downstairs. The awful snoring that resulted from the treatment meant that staying up all night also did the rest of the world a favour. On TV was World Cup cricket. It was not going well for England. This, I thought, was the symbolic moment to take a shit in concert with our batsman. I read the instructions, mixed up a couple of sachets in water of the dreaded movie coal, drank it, and waited. Nothing moved. Not even the England spinners could get any movement out of me. I read further into the instructions. It had been 10 days since I had moved even a rabbit dropping. If this does not work, it may be caused by fecal impaction. Well, I didn't like the sound of that. It sounded like a Hollywood film intro about an asteroid. Fecal impact. The thought of an asteroid coming out of my bum filled me with trepidation. I reached for Wikipedia. I typed fecal impaction. There, in all its horrific glory, was the awful truth. My poo had turned to concrete, and in letters that should have been brightly illuminated in red, it gave the worrying caution, in some cases, it may be necessary to manually manipulate the stool. I realised we were not talking about the three-legged variety. I had overdosed on movie coal, and the movie still hadn't happened. I covered the floor of the loo with newspaper and set about trying to put my fingers in my bum to wiggle the bollard that was wedged inside. Had I been a chimpanzee, this would have been easier. I wandered round the kitchen looking for implements that might work better. A corkscrew, for example, but I thought it best not to. Finally, after wiggling whatever it was while squatting, the cricket on in the background, I finally gave in, sat on the loo and made some awful noises. I can't imagine the pain of birth, but with all respect to womankind, my internal cricket ball finally exited, and I feared that most of my anus had gone with it. The body is made of sterner stuff, though, and for the next 10 minutes I basically expelled what looked like a bag of lemons. They were Star Trek lemons, really. Lemons, Jim, but not as we know them. 3 days later, I drove a car to the garage for maintenance. I caught the train home, Watford Junction to Euston. In my diary is recorded croissant and latte. I ordered the croissant at the station and dipped it in the latte so it was soggy. Victory starts with one small step. 3 days after that, I managed noodles and a salad. It took 3 hours to eat, but I bloody well did it. As I finished, Mick Jagger walked past the window of the cafe on the King's Road. Ha! I'm nearly as skinny as you, I grinned to myself. Next day, I ate steak and vegetables. On the 15th of March, I ate a full meal and could actually taste some of it. On the other hand, I looked like a semi-starved member of the village people. Goodbye moustache. My immune system was still flat on the floor. My T-cells had left the building. The rest of my blood was remarkably good. Maiden played the album to the label Warner on the 2nd of April, and I was there to prove that I was alive and kicking. I went for a break to Lanzarote for 10 days. On the 10th of April, I could stand it no longer, and I tried to sing in the shower. It was awful. There was no vocal control. It just sounded like a cow bellowing. I tried not to panic. I was only a month out of treatment. Jan, my ENT doctor, said, "Don't even think about singing till November." Maybe not November, I thought, but at least the end of September. There is an epidemic of head and neck cancers caused by HPV. The cervical cancer risk is well known, and Pap screening is highly effective, but there's no equivalent test for oral cancer. Cases of HPV oral cancer will rise by 80 to 100% and will overtake cervical cancer in the near future. It's an epidemic that is largely ignored by the press, who often prefer to pillory its victims with shame and innuendo in a way people would find outrageous were it to be inflicted on women, victims of exactly the same cancer. Anyone from taxi drivers and musicians to pilots, diplomats, doctors and engineers, basically any male who has not lived inside a plastic bag, can be struck by this disease. There is a need for research, education and early detection. This is a highly curable cancer. The following week, I went to speak at a dinner for Airbus lawyers. I sat next to a charming Canadian father of 3 in his early 40s. His first question, "How's your saliva?" There was a look in his eye. "You too?" I'd been seeing Dr. Sibtain every 2 weeks post-treatment, and he was delighted by my bouncing back. When I was first diagnosed, I'd run up 4 flights of stairs rather than take the lift. I took great delight in doing it again 1 month after treatment. It was worth it to see the grin on his face. He warned me that the scan to access my results could not take place for around 3 months. The radiation will still be active, he said, so I might just end up with loads of red blobs. On the 13th of May, I went in for the scan. 2 days later, I had the most nervous day of my life. I was clear. Total clinical response. I felt dizzy with shock. I would live. I read through the report. There was a bit towards the end that I did not quite understand. What's this about an anatomical anomaly? Armand started to chuckle. It means that you used to be a fish. Slowly, the world came back to life in all its glory, or otherwise. I had my airline medical reinstated after a stiff examination. The senior doctor commented, "I can't find anything wrong with him, apart from gills and a tail, of course." The hoops to get back in the left seat appeared. Dangerous goods, security, technical refresher training, fire and smoke training, first aid, and finally, back in the simulator for a 6-monthly check. I'd been flying the Fokker for the sheer joy of it. On the 10th of July, I was back flying an airliner from Cardiff to Milan Malpensa. It was a proving flight for the Maltese authorities. I was back in business. Triplane display flying was sadly out of the question. I had to renew my display license and practice with the team, and it was already the middle of the display season. The US Federal Aviation Administration sent me a very nice letter asking me for my medical certificate back. Unlike the UK, which merely suspended it, the FAA took it away as soon as I notified them about the cancer treatment. The maiden PR machine was in full swing. I flew to the jungles of Mexico to do a photo shoot. I had a 6-pack, courtesy of radiation. I don't recommend it as a weight loss program. I reprised the hooligan in a loincloth with a stick shot from the Ross Halfon Bahamas shoot years earlier, and some of the photos looked amazing. I was chartered by the label for a Bruce Air special, taking a posse of fans and media to Paris. We flew to Guillaume Tell Studios, and I talked them through the album. It was great to get behind the wheel in the sky, but also to have my feet on the ground, treading the boards and talking music. The 747 project was back on. Air Atlanta Icelandic were now negotiating with Iron Maiden management, and we had a couple of other carriers quote for the tour. I went on a press junket to the USA and Canada. The album had been very well received, and of course, everyone wanted to know about the whys and wherefores of my cancer, all contributing to the tumour mill. Some journalists attempted some kind of responsible understanding, others just decided to take a vulgar, cheap shot. I was flying, but I still wasn't singing. Back in my kitchen, I regarded the cutlery drawer and the rattling it made with some suspicion. The house was deserted, and I paced around. It was past September, and maybe, just maybe, some sound might emerge from my voice that did not mimic the cutlery drawer. I tried If Eternity Should Fail. It was originally written for a future solo album, but was decanted into Iron Maiden. It was one of the last things I'd sung before I got sick. In fact, I might have been growing the tumour even as I was singing the demo. I couldn't believe the result. The top notes were there. Actually, they seemed to be purer than before. The low mid-range of my voice was unreliable, and certain vowel sounds, E for example, were quite uncontrolled in pitch. My falsetto was also under less control, although the howling banshee wail was still in evidence. Over the next few weeks and months, I tried to make sense of it all. I put myself in vocal rehab and theorised as to why things had changed around. We were due to start the tour in February, and rehearsals were only 3 months away. Rod had made up for a lost year by booking a 72-date world tour. I love your confidence in me, but what if I sing like a bag of spanners? There's no real answer to that, of course. I tried to analyse what I had and what I had lost, at least temporarily. My theory was that after the tumour had gone, the remaining surface of my tongue had changed shape. Think of a thick head on a pint of Guinness. Leave it alone, and the bubbles beneath the surface slowly burst, leaving the head with a bad case of subsidence. My bubbles were a golf ball-sized tumour. The tongue is instrumental in forming complex vowel sounds, and we spend our childhood learning to speak and training it. Singing adds an extra layer of complexity. Dr. Sibtain was correct about my larynx, which was seemingly unaffected. The note generator was intact, but the quality of the end product is heavily influenced by the muscle tone and spaces in the chest, head and neck cavities. I made a plan for rehearsals. I would sing a little and then leave a good few days' rest in the build-up to the band practice. The time from being given the all-clear to starting singing 5 days a week would be only 8 months. Talk about cutting things fine. I set about doing what I could on the other big project, learning to fly the 747. Only one big problem: we didn't have one anymore. 2 months before we were about to go on tour, Air Atlanta Icelandic lost permission to use the plane allocated for us and kindly sent back our deposit. The maiden office was in a tailspin. I got on a plane and went to Iceland. Face-to-face was the only way to find out what was going on. I met the CEO and the head of commercial. We got on very well, and they explained their predicament. The only 747 they could guarantee would have to be flown to the USA to be scrapped 2 days after the show at Donington. Air Atlanta Icelandic were in the process of buying 2 much younger ex-Air France machines, but the deal was not yet sealed. Rather than break a promise, they preferred to cancel the deal. I suggested we use the scrapper only up till Donington. We would pay to ferry it to its grave, where the engines would be kept, as they were in very good shape. The CEO said he would put it to the owner of the aircraft. I left, had a very alcoholic meal with the commercial director, and flew back the next day. When I landed, there was a text message. You have a deal. 3 days later, I got another one. Air France deal done, all back to normal. Breathe a big sigh of relief and get back to the rest of the planet. I flew some disabled veterans in simulators for Help for Heroes, and I returned to Sarajevo, where the Bosnians were putting the finishing touches to a very emotional documentary they'd been making about the trip I did over 20 years ago. I'd missed the 20th anniversary because of my cancer treatment, but I wanted to help them with some follow-up footage and an interview. It was hard to recognise the place at times. Then, suddenly, a piece would snap into place and the jigsaw of memories would return. In order to fly the 747, I had to get a job with Air Atlanta Icelandic as a captain, so I sat at home with my laptop and the manual for the 747. I completed the ground school course and sat the final exams. All good. The next phase was the simulator. It was winter of 2015. I'd run myself ragged. I caught a cold. Actually, I was delighted. My immune system worked as advertised. The only very strange thing was that my mucous membranes were not yet in fully working order. Having a cold without blowing your nose is quite an odd experience. How different this Christmas was to the one a year previously. I was blessed to be here, and better than that, I felt alive. Putting on a bit of weight was the name of the game, but I wouldn't be doing it by eating all my favourite puddings. While most of my taste buds were playing ball, the ones that detected sweetness had been severely impaired by the radiation. As the man who ate the Toblerone from the minibar and who loved to pig out on caramel sauce and crunchy bars, this was, initially, a blow to morale. After a few months, the memory still remained, but the desire to eat sugar had virtually vanished. An unintended consequence was an acute awareness of how awful many of the foods, or rather products, were that I had chomped my way through in years past. The realization that flavour was often just added sugar was a great revelation. I took solace in the fact that vegetables, meat and dairy tasted absolutely 100%. Beer was a worry. I'd designed Trooper with fully operational taste buds. How would it taste, and how would I design future brews with an impaired sense of sweetness? I took inspiration from the chef, who had no sense of smell. There are many other complex flavours and aromas to experiment with in beer, not just sugar. The first test of this was the design of our new beer, Red and Black, an Imperial Stout Porter. Martin Weeks, the master brewer, and I sat down and painted the taste of the beer with a palette of existing brews. I was, I freely confess, nervous. I realised that I could detect sweetness, but just couldn't taste it. Nevertheless, Martin and I agreed on all aspects of the brew. In fact, I was inspired to take a new look at beer design and take a more aromatic approach. The subtleties of texture, bitterness and a lingering finish in the nose took on ever greater importance. Thankfully, my old favourite, Fuller's ESB, never failed. Drinking beer, of course, is something that should be done a long way from aircraft simulators or motor cars. No sooner had the new year passed than I found myself turning up to the newly built British Airways training centre on a freezing, windy 2nd of January. What a roller coaster of a year. Looking back further, what a roller coaster of a life. From the ups and downs of school and university to the longest and fastest theme park ride drop ever, being in Iron Maiden. I've often been asked, would you have changed anything? The answer is a simple no. A different and better question is, have you made any mistakes? And the answer to that one is equally easy, loads of them. Learning to sing and perform is trial by error and fire. Training to fly can be done in a simulator. Learning to be an aviator can only be done with experience, and experience comes with mistakes built into its fabric. So now I met one of my 747 mentors. He took me off to one side in a corner of the coffee room before my simulator partner showed up. "How's your saliva after treatment?" he asked. I couldn't believe it. Another "you too" moment. We spent 20 minutes discussing teeth, jawbones, saliva, and his love of fine Scotch whisky and fast motor cars. His treatment was somewhat more brutal than mine because the technology was not so advanced 15 years previously as to be able to spare his parotid glands from extinction. Here we were, though, and we soon got on to more important things like a 400-ton flying machine with a fuel capacity of 170,000 kilograms that would soon be under the command of yours truly. What an impossible dream for a kid from Worksop who failed physics O-level and took 3 goes to get O-level maths. Somewhere, my old grandfather Austin is drinking a beer with my godfather, Flight Sergeant John Booker, and they're probably adding up the amount of money they spent on plastic aeroplanes between them. Nothing in childhood is ever wasted. The same childlike thrill came over me when I sat in the 747 simulator for the first time. All checks complete, and the first officer briefed. I turned to the instructor with a grin. "What does this button do?" Afterword. An autobiography is a strange beast, and an unruly one. Is it a shopping list of events in sequence? Is it a selection of in-jokes that seemed funny at the time? Is it a pointless exercise, especially if you've just finished your 5th iteration and you are only 25? My answer is that I didn't want to be any of the above. I just wanted to tell a good story. I wrote in excess of 160,000 words, and there are fewer than 110,000 of them left. Plenty of funny anecdotes never made the cut, simply because they didn't advance the narrative. Somewhere there is a book of anecdotes, but it's not a coherent tale. Had I chosen to include airships, wives, divorces, children, and entrepreneurial activities, this would have been approaching 800 pages long. It would have been the type of book that people use to commit murder or help change tyres on London buses. One thing is for sure, it would be a very unread Christmas present. I made a personal executive decision when I started to write. No births, marriages, or divorces of me or anybody else. There's enough here to be getting on with. Any more would be overkill. And overkill, as Winston Churchill observed, serves only to make the rubble bounce. That was What Does This Button Do by Bruce Dickinson, read by Bruce Dickinson. This programme was produced by ID Audio for Harper Audio. A HarperCollins audio book. Text copyright Bruce Dickinson, 2017. Production copyright 2017 by HarperCollins Publishers. All rights reserved. Bruce Dickinson asserts the moral right to be identified as the author of this work. Thank you for listening.